Welcome to our session on grief, loss, and bereavement, coming to terms with COVID-related losses. We're pleased to welcome back Dr. Kira Mauseth. I'd like to begin by sharing a little bit of information about the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We provide training and technical assistance to behavioral health and primary care providers and school and social service staff whose work has the potential to improve behavioral health outcomes for individuals with or at risk of developing serious mental illness in SAMHSA's Region 10, that's Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington State. We focus on evidence-based practices for serious mental health issues such as psychosis, but we provide free training on a variety of topics, including integrated care, suicide prevention, diversity and equity issues, school mental health, peer support, trauma-informed approaches, and more. We fulfill our mission through live events like this one, free self-paced online courses, newsletters, a resource library on our website. We connect with other training centers and organizations. And to find out more, I would encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website, and follow us on social media. I'd like to take a moment for a land acknowledgement. We are based in Seattle, Washington, and our center is sitting on the traditional land of the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples, past and present. We're grateful for their stewardship of this land throughout the generations, and we acknowledge their continuing presence in our culture and region. Just a note about language. It's our intention to always be mindful of using language that promotes recovery and is culturally appropriate. We encourage everyone to use language that demonstrates respect for a person's dignity and worth, is consistent with recovery-oriented practices, and promotes treatment environments that foster respect, human dignity, and hope. We are recording this session, so keep confidentiality concerns in mind. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kira Mauseth. She's a clinical psychologist who sees patients at Snohomish Psychology Associates. She also teaches at Seattle University, and she serves as a co-lead for the Behavioral Health Strike Team for the Washington State Department of Health. Her work and research interests focus on resilience, trauma, and disaster behavioral health. She's worked extensively in Haiti with earthquake survivors, as well as in Jordan with refugees and with first responders and healthcare workers throughout Puget Sound and the United States. She conducts trainings like this one about disaster preparedness and building resilience with local communities, organizations, and educational groups. I'm pleased to welcome back Dr. Kira Mauseth, and without further ado, I will hand the mic over to her.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for coming. It's 11 in Seattle area, Washington Pacific time, I suppose, but I love all the chats and everybody checking in from all over the place. It is so nice to see faces and to connect with people from all over. So I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you all today, to share this information and have some discussion with you all. I really appreciate all of your participation because we can all learn so much from each other as providers and just as people, actually. So we're going to be doing a breakout room about halfway through today in small groups so that you have a chance to share some ideas with each other and sort of bounce some things back and forth. I really do encourage you to ask any questions that you have in the chat as we go. I will try to keep an eye on that as things progress. And if there are any direct questions I can answer as I'm going, I'm happy to do that. So that's the plan. I'm going to go ahead and jump in. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions. So one sec, I'm going to get the chat available too. Pull it all up so I can see everything as I'm going. Okay, I think you can see that. Good. All right. So it's a challenging topic. It's a complicated thing, and the pandemic experience of the disaster has really directly and indirectly complicated our experience of grief and loss. And so we're going to try and address some of that today. And again, I really encourage you, particularly in the breakout room opportunity, to share with each other, sort of lessons learned and experiences and ideas that are helpful. I'm going to give you some context about what's happened in terms of the way that the pandemic has had some specific effects on the experience of grief and loss and some of the challenges that presents for us as providers. I'm going to talk about the collective experience, how to work through it, suggestions for process and content for folks. And then I'm going to share with you another acronym model. I love acronyms. I develop them for all kinds of things that I share professionally because it helps me remember stuff. It helps me kind of stay organized. So I have a model that I'm going to be sharing with you as well. Okay, so in general, you know, a lot of this information, at least initially, probably is not new to you. I'm just trying to summarize to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page before we move on. So it's really important to understand that a pandemic is classified as a natural disaster. And so disasters are sort of a natural source of loss for people in general, in a variety of different ways. There are primary effects of a disaster, and in the pandemic, those are things like getting sick, getting hospitalized, losing a loved one directly, and there are secondary effects. And so the secondary things are sometimes more subtle, sometimes not. Those are things like social effects, political effects, economic effects, educational effects. And there has been grief and loss associated with both primary and secondary effects of this thing for more than a year now. And the difficulty in processing some of those loss experiences that most of us have is that we have not, in many ways, been able to access sort of the traditional processes that have worked. I don't think, I'm just going to make a big generalization to start out. I think culturally, just as a huge generalization, we struggle with managing the experience of grief, loss, and bereavement from a behavioral health lens. I think that's always been a little bit tricky and a little bit of a challenge. And I think that the experience of COVID, because of the nature of this particular disaster, has compounded that. So we're really dealing with a double experience in a lot of ways, and a sense of grief and loss that is very, very widespread across different communities at various levels, right? Not every individual or family or community has experienced the same kinds of losses in the same kinds of ways. So there are so many individual differences here too, which also adds to the complexity of this issue. I wanted to just point out a couple of these things. There's some really interesting new data and research about the effect that COVID has had on people's experience of grief and loss. Specifically, a study that identifies that when you lose a close relative, or if you have lost a close relative to COVID-19, there is a sort of a ripple effect to about 9 other people on average, right? So that's just statistical, but that's a really, really big ripple effect. And there is so much extensive social experience of loss that it affects our ability to sort of process in the moment and grieve, and work through the loss in a way that we, you know, based on previous coping mechanisms and techniques that we had used prior to the pandemic, for sure. Other things that I want to mention about this, it is very, very common for us to see in private practice that you might see an elevated acute or a stronger acute sense of grief and loss from the clients that you're working with, for those of you who are providers, whether in a primary care context or a specialty behavioral health context. Being in a disaster and having a loss, specifically of a person, is associated with the higher risk of a prolonged grief disorder of some kind. It's often co-occurring with anxiety, depression, and sometimes PTSD as well, depending. There certainly have been some incredibly traumatic experiences that healthcare workers have gone through, especially when at earlier phases and at different points in the pandemic, healthcare workers in many cases were the only human being available and witnessing the death or loss of a human being who was with them when that person's family members, that patient's family members, couldn't be with them. So it is complicated, it's extensive, and it affects all of us sort of nationally in these nuanced ways. One of my colleagues said something incredibly insightful the other day, and it was the idea that even when there is a small loss, even when there's just something small that happens, and I don't mean insignificant, but I mean a loss that we would kind of navigate as a bump in the road in our life previous to the pandemic, any loss that all of us experience right now is touching on something that is much deeper and much more significant because of the whole year. So it's loss right now is connecting to a deeper sense of loss in all of us as professionals and as people that everybody has experienced to some degree based on both the primary and secondary effects of the pandemic itself. So the emotional responses and the reactions that all of us are likely to have maybe, and in many cases are often much stronger than they would be if it was not the context of a disaster. Emotion regulation is already a challenge, right? That's already something that people are struggling with because of how tired our brains are. And it is even more so in the context of grief and loss when there is so much distress that people are experiencing. This chart is representative. This is a new update to this graph that I don't know if any of you have seen this or not yet. It came out last week from the Department of Health, but it is a visual indicator of the vast discrepancy in how different people, individuals, family members, and communities are doing right now. A large number of folks, again, not just in Washington, but in various states and all over the region and the nation, are feeling a lot better. A lot of adults are feeling less anxious, they're feeling less depressed, and they're experiencing the transition very clearly from disillusionment into reconstruction and recovery. This pattern is a known pattern. And so as we move into spring, this is where we're headed. Now, the issue of note, especially with regard to this topic, is the dotted line that you see on this chart. And that's the pathway that's representing what's called a disaster cascade. For people who are on the dotted line disaster cascade pathway, those are folks who have experienced some degree of primary or secondary effect from the disaster that has caused another impact for them. That could be the loss of a loved one, that could be an eviction, that could be the loss of a job, that could be just the compounded stress of homeschooling or working on remote schooling with kids, that could be working in healthcare and being overwhelmed by the amount of need and having to even manage and help your colleagues who might be sick or suffering, right? So the disaster cascade represented by the dotted line is a known entity with all disasters, and it's what happens when there's another impact, a secondary impact that occurs within about a year. So there are a lot of folks who have experienced that, and the reason why this is important in terms of behavioral health sort of clinical management is to recognize that even though the effects of the pandemic were very, very discrepant before, right? We were not in the same boat, same storm, different boats, you may have heard. What happens as we move forward into reconstruction and recovery actually exacerbates those differences. It actually makes the behavioral health symptoms more extremely different from each other in terms of where people are. So when you're seeing a client, when you're working with a patient, when you're sitting around a conference table with your colleagues, the discrepancy for where people are in terms of their feelings, like how their emotional management is going, their level of depression or their anxiety, it's going to get bigger, and that's a challenge for management for sure. Some of that has to do with grief and loss, and some of it is related to just other experiences in this pandemic. But it's really important to be mindful that every person who's walking through the door is going to be in a very different place on this pattern than they would have been previously, more so now than before. I mentioned a second ago that any loss that we all experience right now is touching on a deep well of loss. And it is usually as a result of that, a stronger emotional reaction. Part of that is the direct result of how tired our limbic system is right now, right? So everybody's brain, and I can say that, I mean, children, adults, adolescents, the human brain right now has been dealing with so much cortisol and so much stress, potentially traumatic. Some not always traumatic, but at the very least, there's been stress. There hasn't always been trauma. It depends. Sometimes both. And the consequence is that the limbic system is very, very exhausted, and it's functioning not particularly efficiently right now. So our biologic ability to process the emotions and to sort of work through things is more strained. It's a little bit more limited, and people generally are more likely to react impulsively right now, and to react in terms of their behavior, their emotional response, and then their behavior also from that self-protective, defensive, and sort of impulsive way. That's kind of where we are neurologically right now. The other reason why that's happening is because the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain, right, that's responsible for some of the filtering and the organization and the planning and the strategy, that part has not been as necessary for survival throughout the pandemic. So we are collectively having a great deal of trouble concentrating, focusing, planning, organizing ourselves, and also filtering and controlling our emotional responses to things. So because the limbic system is so influential in our behavior and our processing right now, the manifestation and the experience of grief and loss is that much stronger. Which is not to say there's anything wrong with that. It's a challenge for sure. But the emotional processing is heightened as a result of where we are at more than a year now into this pandemic. Other issues, this is a slide that I've presented before in other trainings. So in an effort to not repeat myself, if you've seen any of them, the ones on here that specifically apply to grief and loss and the management of bereavement, the cognitive and thinking issues continue to be a primary problem for most people. We really are having trouble staying focused, staying organized. And for those clients and patients who have experienced any sort of degree of grief and loss that they believe is affecting their ability to function, cognition is going to be at the top of that list. In addition to the emotional upheaval and sort of that impulsive responding. Behaviorally, where it might show up is people acting out of character, right? You're going to see more behavioral extremes, either acting out or acting in, expressing distress internally by acting in, shutting down, hopelessness, not participating as a function of grief and loss, right? Or the opposite side of the coin is acting out, being aggressive, potentially engaging in illegal behavior, taking risks, which is another also common response to grief and loss that is likely to be exacerbated right now based on where we are at this point in the pandemic. It's also incredibly common for people to have trouble sleeping, be struggling with either not eating or stress eating too much, and really just having trouble regulating their biological systems as a function of so much stress over such a long period of time. Okay, so specific methods for working with grief and loss and bereavement during this incredibly challenging time. This might not be very concrete, but it is based on data. So it is a challenge. There is no specific time frame. There's no right or wrong way in terms of feeling and processing grief and loss. We have had to be incredibly creative with how we facilitate helping clients and helping patients process grief and loss during this time. Like I've mentioned before, the typical options, the typical techniques for getting together, gathering, and celebrating, honoring, working through things collectively have been challenged, or in some cases not an option at all. So the time frame is thrown off. Recovery is going to differ, like I said, more dramatically right now for each person than it typically would. And what we want to emphasize professionally is staying focused on validation and engaging in active listening. Active listening is the single most consistent recommendation in terms of a preferred intervention, not just for grief and loss, but for helping people manage all of the nuances of the pandemic experience in general. It is probably not for this audience today, but in general, active listening is not something that we do a lot of typically. And it is incredibly effective in a disaster, and it is particularly effective in a disaster for issues of bereavement and grief and loss. It just allows the person who has lost something or someone to really work through their experience, and it's all focused on deep understanding rather than problem solving or fixing. There can be clinically an opportunity and an appropriate opportunity to help people problem solve, to help people address and directly jump in and figure out what works best for them. But starting with active listening is the preferred recommendation. So that's where it should go. Open-ended questions, who, what, where, when, why, how. And people do have the opportunity with open-ended questions to say fine, right? If you say, how are things going right now? They say fine, and they kind of shut down. But continuing to open that door, continuing to ask those open-ended questions, it's likely that people will walk through that door if it remains open. It's not a guarantee. But that's clinically one of the things that we have the opportunity to provide for people is that open door for them to walk through. And then, part of this management process of grief and loss is recognizing where our own experiences come into play with trying to support other people. Because of the way that the pandemic has affected our lives, everyone has lost something. We've all lost something in this last, 18 months or so. And I should say 16 months or so. And so it really challenges our ability to help support other people who are dealing with acute grief and loss when we too, it's touching on that experience for all of us as well. Sorry, I want to keep an eye on the chat. Yeah, Yeah, we're all going through this to a degree, right? So it really does challenge our capacity. I do want to add one thing. Active listening is the 5-star recommendation in terms of an intervention. However, it really is something that can only and should only be done when you personally have the clinical capacity to empathize with other people. If you personally are struggling with compassion fatigue as a provider, it is okay to not do this, to step back and to not engage in this way. Active listening really only is effective and helpful when you have the capacity as a helping person to provide empathy and that space, that sort of safe, calm pool for people to experience the loss. If you don't, and you need to take a step back and take a little bit of a break, just to recognize, have that awareness around like that you need your own opportunity to process, and that if you are struggling with compassion fatigue, that this particular type of work with bereavement might be something that you need to step away from temporarily, at least. And it is appropriate to ask for help from colleagues and other professionals. There's a great suggestion in the chat from Debbie. Release a balloon, plant a tree, or journal around the loss. I'm going to make some other suggestions too as we go forward. So those are great. Those are good ideas. There are also lots of opportunities to sort of, like the planting a tree idea, to contribute in a positive way to something that can grow and that can literally take root, is a really nice metaphor for life ongoing in a healthy way. This chart is representing what's called sort of a circle of, sort of like an emotional contact circle. And here's what I mean by this. When we are trying to support people who have experienced grief and loss, one of the things that I have commonly heard, I've heard students say this, I've heard clients say this, is that when you are the person dealing with the loss, what really is frustrating and very, very difficult to manage is when someone else who is less directly affected becomes more emotionally needy about the situation. And what I mean by that is that when we go to engage with people who need support, whether this is personally or individually or professionally, the people who are most directly affected by the loss get the most degree of comfort, and they are allowed to, by virtue of this model, express that distress outwardly. It doesn't go the other way. So someone who is only peripherally related to a loss, right, should be focusing on the comfort that they can provide in towards the center of the circle, and the person that's closest to the center of the circle should be focusing on expressing and getting that distress out from the center of the circle forward. It doesn't go the opposite way. So the comment, I guess, to give you an example, the comment that I've heard from people about what's really frustrating is when I actually had a student share with me this the other day. He had been diagnosed with cancer, and he had a friend come to the hospital to support him. And the friend kept making comments to the effect of, I can't believe how hard this is, that we can't hang out together, that you're here doing chemo. This is so hard for me. And the friend made it about themselves. And this was a student in this context, but to his experience, he was there, he was the one undergoing chemo. And so the experience of comfort needed to be directed towards him, not the other way around. So one of the red flags for us as providers is to really recognize that we don't put our clients or our patients in a position to flip that table and be the ones comforting us. And again, there's a lot of self-awareness that's needed for that, because we have to recognize our own capacity and our own set of resources that we have, and when we need support and when we need care, to go looking for that in those appropriate ways. But this is a unidirectional thing. It doesn't flow both ways, is the idea. Okay, a little bit more about active listening as the recommendation before we do breakout rooms. So there are a lot of things you can find online that are recommended ways to help people process grief and loss. Active listening remains consistently at the top of the list as an intervention to do. Asking open-ended questions, reflecting back to make sure that you are deeply understanding what the person's experience is, that you're not making assumptions, and not being afraid to potentially offer things directly. I think clinically, one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is to leave everything open-ended and to put the pressure on the person who's lost something to come up with a solution. So one of the recommendations that I'll talk about again later is for the supporting person, whether that's professionally or personally, to offer a direct suggestion. Would it be helpful for me to bring some meals? Would it be helpful for me to engage, to do some laundry for you, like those practical, very specific, real life kinds of things, rather than tell me what it is you need. Because subconsciously, right, what that's doing is putting the onus on the grieving person to come up with something and develop an idea. And I think collectively we can do a little bit better job in honing that down and providing more appropriate and direct support to the people who are experiencing grief and loss. Again, I'm going to come back to some of those ideas in a minute, but this is about really, really emphasizing that active listening is a incredibly helpful tool that we have, and it's usually going to work regardless of where people are in their particular bereavement process. Even when someone is very, very angry and upset, active listening is an effective intervention to try. So for the breakout rooms, I would just like you to take about 10 minutes. I would encourage people to turn their cameras on if they're comfortable doing so and engage. We're just going to have 3 or 4 people in each breakout room. And to make suggestions with each other. What are some suggestions that you know work or that you have used in the past to help support clients and patients during this experience? Consider specific phrases, specific questions, specific interactions that you've tried. And then also maybe some pitfalls like, oh, I tried this and it didn't go over so well. This is kind of some suggestion for what to avoid. But also, what are some other concrete suggestions and some offers of help like those that I just suggested that might really be effective in supporting folks? So just sharing a little bit about best practices with each other for a few minutes, and then we will come back together and discuss further. Hello, everybody. Thank you. I really appreciated the conversation that we had in our room. I'm hoping that if you had some great ideas and some good reflections that came up in your rooms, that you can share them with everyone in the chat. I really want to try and increase, to the extent that we can in this group today, increase the sharing of information for those of us who are seeking that out today. So please do go ahead and put some takeaway points in the chat. I would really encourage people to think about something that came up in our group that I'd like to share with you all is this idea of how to measure the value of active listening. I know I've been talking about how important it is, but active listening is, it's hard to value in the same kind of way because we don't typically measure, we don't measure success with active listening in the same way that we would say, okay, well, if we problem solve for a client, if someone's lost somebody and we help them solve problems around that, that's measurable. Like I can mathematically work that out. Like I was useful today. Active listening doesn't work that way. However, what I will say that this came up in our room is that active listening increases connection between the speaker and the listener, and connection is an essential part of resilience. Resilience has 4 ingredients, and that's not part of this talk today, but I'll just throw them out there. Purpose, a sense of purpose and a sense of motivation, connection, adaptability, and hope. Those are the 4 things. And connection is increased through active listening. It's something that we desperately need in times of COVID. It's something that has been under threat because of in my opinion, the significant misuse of social distancing versus physical distancing. We got off on the wrong track by calling it social distancing when we should have called it physical distancing at the very beginning of this thing. So we need to be connected. We need to be emotionally connected to people, focused on empathy, focused on compassion, recognizing our own limits and our own necessity for those of us who do clinical work in this area to take care of ourselves, to take a step back and to give ourselves space before we continue to engage and continue to try and empathize, because that is a very draining experience. Yeah, it's ongoing, right? It is an ongoing thing. Sending postcards and encouraging support, great examples and great ideas. The cloud, there's ways you can do, there's ways we can use technology. It's hard to be creative when our brains are so limbic system focused right now. So creativity is so important for adaptability, like that's part of resilience as well, but it's been incredibly challenging because our brains are so survival oriented that being creative is a different part, right? That's not coming very naturally right now. So great ideas and great suggestions. Remember that we have when we have thoughts about those we've lost, they're standing next to you. There's a great book for kids that it's called The Invisible String. I would highly recommend it as a clinician. The Invisible String. It is an invisible string that connects us with everyone, even people that we've lost. And it's a powerful story that kids can really identify with, I think. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. There's one last comment that I will make because I were just reminded of it in my own head when I was talking about kids. One of the misconceptions that I run into a lot when I teach psychological recovery in a disaster is the idea that when a family member has lost someone, adults in that family will often try to, quote unquote, protect the child by not giving them the information about someone's death or loss. So I mean in this context, I mean it in a literal sense, like the loss of a person. That has been shown to be not as helpful as adults tend to think it is. So the reason why it matters is that kids need to be given developmentally appropriate information about the loss that has occurred in order for them to participate in the healing process. Oftentimes when adults are trying to protect kids by not saying that grandma passed away or whatever happened with the loss, children tend to make up an explanation in their own minds, which is often worse than the reality of whatever the situation is. So it has been, supported in terms of research as well, with making sure to offer accurate and developmentally appropriate information to kids. Yeah, Debbie's comment in the chat, grandpa isn't sleeping or on vacation or just left on a trip, because especially young kids will tend to interpret that as, did I do something to make grandpa go away? So really appropriate to continue to offer that, and then include children in rituals and things, which I'll say more about in just a second. Someone did ask me directly in the chat, could I repeat the components of resilience? Yes, those aren't specifically part of this, but they are relevant to all of our work, I think. So the ingredients of resilience are purpose, which is about motivation and reorienting around what your purpose is. Connection, which is anything that stops you from being isolated. Purpose, connection, adaptability, which is our skill that we have to sort of roll with things and adjust to changes, and hope. And hope is about realism and opportunity, not optimism. Hope is about realistic opportunity for growth and perceiving things as challenging rather than threatening. So purpose, connection, adaptability, and hope. Great examples, everybody. Thank you. Okay, so we talked about process, active listening, 5-star recommendation for process. Content considerations, if you are clinically or professionally supporting people who have experienced grief and loss. After the active listening, and again, after being the key word there is an opportunity and there can be room for problem solving. That is often a helpful thing, but I want to really emphasize active listening coming first. Facilitating problem solving by really encouraging clients and folks not to make big decisions in a grief and loss, especially during the acute phases of grief and loss, just to slow down, to sort of take a little bit more time, not make big financial decisions, not make big physical decisions, just pace themselves through decision making, because that impulsivity is a big risk in an acute period of grief and loss. If traditional strategies either aren't available or aren't working, then figure out coping plans, figuring out creative alternatives to keep people connected so they're not isolated. Grief and isolation and hopelessness are a trifecta that we really want to try and reduce or avoid. And so continuing to develop new connections or maintain existing connections is very, very helpful. Simple, concrete tasks. What is one thing that needs to get done today, right? If the client or person needs support identifying those things. The more experience somebody has reaching the small goals, like you got to keep it scalable. The small goals that they have, their self-efficacy, their confidence is going to grow over time. That's complicated in terms of how that works, right? But facilitating for a client or a patient, identifying and then engaging in very, very concrete, very simple tasks in order to experience success and achievement is very helpful. in grief. You can provide psychoeducation about the grief process. There's tons of stuff. There's a website that's been put in the chat. There's lots of other information that you can just find online. Warning signs of a particularly complicated grief and a traumatic experience. We don't want to pathologize things that aren't pathological. Like that's a big red flag for me. Like, we don't want to make something diagnostic when it's part of the normal process. And what I will say about that, sort of the takeaway point, is that the grief that people are having now is going to be, by definition and by nature, more extreme than it would have been, and not in a disaster. It's doubled and it's tripled and it's layered with all of these other experiences of loss. So be very, very careful to not judge something as being pathological when it is, in fact, an extreme emotional reaction that actually makes sense under the circumstances. So we just need to use our most accurate clinical judgment and get consultation from colleagues around that. Lots of things layering on top of each other right now. Okay, this last section that I'm going to share with you before we do questions is a HEAL model. So this is an acronym that can help you organize areas of focus for grief and loss in general. The starting points, it's not just about the loss of a person. People can go through the experience of grief and loss when it's a loss of identity, a loss of meaning, a loss of status, a loss of an idea or a principle. I mean, it's very, very clear that in 2020, individual people, communities, family members, there's been so much loss and grief associated with marginalization and discrimination and racism, right? So it is not always concretely about the loss of an individual person. Oftentimes those losses are connected to something that's much bigger than that. Just to keep in mind that the context is different for folks, right? Other starting points: no right or wrong way to process grief. It is not uncommon for a child, when you've told them that a family member has passed away, to say, okay, can I go play now? And that's just how they think about things. So kids are going to be in different time frames. Adults are going to be in different time frames. No right or wrong with that. It is very, very common for people to process through a variety of different phases. I would say there's no specific time frame for people to process grief and loss. The idea of a year, I think it's a really challenging social concept that we think after a year has passed, you need to be quote unquote over it. That is not true. The reason why we've used that year marker in clinical psychology is because after a calendar year goes by, all of the major events have taken place, right? All the holidays, the birthday, right? It doesn't mean that the loss is over. It doesn't mean that the person is over it. I'm not suggesting that at all. It means that all of the calendar markers have passed. And the next time they go around, it will be different. Not necessarily better, not necessarily easier, but different. I saw something yesterday, actually, where a gentleman said, I was told that grief comes in waves, and they lied to me. Grief is not waves. It's a heavy blanket that I can't shrug off. And I would say for that person, that's totally accurate. For other people, it feels like waves. For some people, it feels like a heavy blanket that you can't shrug off. So there are no guidelines around what this experience feels like. Okay. There's no particular order, right? We have trouble with that. Humans like to have structure to things, and grief and loss doesn't fall into those neat categories. Okay, so the first part of the HEAL model is to honor the loss, not avoid, right? Avoidance is a really, really dangerous thing with clinical psychology and with psychological health in general. We want to honor the memory, the idea, the situation. We want to process through the experience, whatever it is that's been lost, when it is possible and when we can do it, to participate in ceremonies or events, even if it's online. I participated in 2 online memorial services this last year that were incredibly powerful. It is not any way that I would have predicted celebrating someone's life, but they really were incredibly powerful. So just because something's different right now doesn't mean that it can't meet a need. And there are ways to process individually and honor experiences privately without having a big public display. So honoring the loss somehow, in some form or fashion. Express emotions, no wrong emotions. The one that I have run into clinically that's the most common is anger. And that's the one that people feel really uncomfortable with. Like they feel guilty because they feel angry, maybe with the person who has died or with the experience that has happened. Anger is an incredibly socially acceptable emotion to have in the United States, right? Anger is a go-to emotion. And oftentimes more difficult emotions like fear and sadness get expressed through anger. And that's normal. Our brains are set up that way. And we are sort of socially conditioned, for lack of a better word, to express anger rather than to express sadness or to express fear. So being angry is a very, very common experience that people have with grief and loss. That is, it's something that we feel uncomfortable about, but it's normal, and it's good to know. Emotional flattening, not expressing much of anything, as well as a very, very deep sadness that can feel debilitating, like I just can't function. Those are also normal. So express emotion, there's no wrong ones. The next one is to acknowledge the obstacles that are getting in your way. Common obstacles are anytime you find yourself in your own head saying, but if I had, but if I had done this, if they had just, but if, right? That's an obstacle. That's an obstacle that's in the way of acknowledging the loss. So it's wishing it were different, the if onlys or the but ifs, or pretending like it's not happening, which are, again, they're common for a reason. It's not abnormal. It's a common way for the human brain and body to sort of manage a really, really difficult experience. And again, the acknowledgement is not necessarily about the loss of a person, but the loss of an identity or an experience as well. So acknowledging the things in the way is a helpful thing when people are able to do it. And those are just some common examples. The last one is to live. And I know that's kind of broad, but the idea is that eventually, with no timeline and no pressure attached to it, it is about living again. This is about breathing. This is about every day just surviving and simply existing until you feel like you can start to live again. With, again, no pressure and expectation for when that needs to happen or how, but the active process of living is different, and it's a different physiological and it's a different mental and emotional experience than survival. And it is something, because I have hope is one of my fundamental core values. It is something that I believe all human beings have the capacity to do. We are not just survivors. We are survivors, but we're not just survivors, right? We can live, we can actively thrive even after incredibly difficult losses. I've seen that. I've seen that in Haiti. I've seen that in the refugee camps in Jordan. Actively living doesn't need to be, it's not about success. It's not about great achievement. It's about finding a way to move forward in your own life. And again, I really want to emphasize with this one that there is not an expectation about pressure or timeline for when to do it. It's about learning how to slowly re-engage with yourself and participate and to discuss. And resilience can help with that too. These last two slides are just resources for you all. There are a variety of resources that our team has written for the Department of Health, and everything can be found on this website. And I believe it was already posted in the chat where the when you'll get a copy of the slides, or I guess it wouldn't be a copy sent to you, but it will be a link that's available for you to access and download the slides. So with the few minutes that we've got left, I will go ahead and answer any questions that you have, if you have them.
So I have one. I am a high school psychologist, and I've been doing the Rainbows groups.
Okay.
And one of the things that's not in the curriculum is the COVID situation. So we have a handful of kids who've lost either a parent or a grandparent, and they have not been able, because of COVID, they were not able to see the person who was in the hospital before they died, while they were dying. Mm-hmm. And this has added, I think, like a whole nother dimension. to grief. And
Yes.
I think, do you have any suggestions as far as that's concerned?
I agree with you 100%. It has added a whole nother dimension and it complicates what was already a complicated process. I think that even in an educational setting, it is very, very likely that you're going to see lots of behavioral disruption as a result of those grief and loss experiences. That's going to be a challenge for most kids coming back into classroom anyway. A little bit of developmental regression, a little bit of behavioral, like being kind of out of sorts, discombobulated. But it is, I think, going to be really common to see grief and loss expressed in such a way, because teenagers and adolescents and kids don't have the neurological development that adults do. You're going to see it expressed in all kinds of different ways. I think it would be a great idea, if such a thing is possible in your circumstances, to get a group together so that kids can talk about the things that they've lost, sort of a group therapy opportunity if you can have a skilled facilitator, especially when it's peers that are about the same age, because nobody gets it like peers do. Not to put pressure on any particular leader amongst the youth, but to have an adult facilitate it, a trusted adult. Other things with that.
We've been doing the rainbows groups, and it comes up. You know, they actually they are working through the groups. We do like remembering activities, and the curriculum is amazing. But the thing that keeps coming up is that they didn't have that closure. That they didn't have, you know.
Yeah. So clinically, a technique for that, sorry, I meant to get there and I forgot, COVID brain again. You can do a couple different activities. You can ask them to write a letter. So there's two different things. If you don't have if they can't connect to a therapist that can help them work that out, like in person, writing a letter, a journal entry, or a letter to send to the person that they have lost in order to try and gain that closure on their half of the relationship, even when someone has passed, that's a helpful process to go through. If you can get them into a one-on-one therapy situation, it is helpful for them to, if they need to talk to an empty chair or to the seat next to them as if the person was still there and say whatever it is that they need to say. So those are two. The second one needs to be facilitated by a professional of some kind, for the most part, but the letter writing, and then you can, like, there was an example, you can write a letter and then you can do something with the letter, like let it float away or even burn it, or there's going to be different things that work for different people, right? But writing a letter and then letting that process get managed psychologically.
That's a great idea. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for your time today and your contributions in the chat and the breakout rooms. I'm afraid we are out of time. Just wanted to encourage everybody to do our evaluation survey to keep the free training and TA coming. And I wanted to extend a hearty thanks to our presenter, Dr. Kira Mauseth. I hope you'll join us in 2 weeks for the next round of skills modules with her. I believe that the topic is going to be resilience, which I think we can all use a good, healthy helping of.
I couldn't remember. That's my COVID brain. I couldn't remember what the topic was. Yes,
I remember because it's written down.
Right.
So thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate your time today. Join us online. Join us on social media. Join our newsletter, and we'll see you another time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.